3 months had passed since Unipar killed Supreme Arbiter Rexstan, and in that time, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Vorath supremacy, an empire that had stood unchallenged for 10,000 years, was crumbling from within as its own sacred laws were turned against it by a human woman who stood barely 1.5 meters tall. Una had conducted over 200 judgments during those 3 months, and every single one had ended the same way: found worthy. Declared free species that had been enslaved for generations walked out of the arena of judgment as liberated peoples. And worlds that had been stripped of their resources and dignity were returned to their original inhabitants. The Emperor had tried everything to stop her. 7 assassination attempts had been launched against Una during her time on Kethvorin, and each one had failed spectacularly. The first assassin was a Vorath Special Forces operative who tried to poison her food, and Una had detected the toxin by smell and forced the assassin to consume his own poison before the entire court. The second and third assassins attacked her in her chambers, and their bodies were found the next morning arranged in the traditional Vorath position of shame, killed by their own blade arms. The fourth assassin was a shape-shifting Kethvari mercenary who had been promised enough credits to buy his own planet, and Una identified him by the way he walked and broke his neck before he could complete his transformation. The fifth, sixth, and seventh assassins disappeared entirely, and their fates became the subject of whispered stories among the Vorath population. "She is not human," the whispers said, "and she is a demon sent to punish us for our sins." But Una was entirely human, and that was precisely what made her so terrifying. She was a member of a species that had evolved on a world where everything wanted to kill them, where survival required constant vigilance and adaptability, where the weak and the careless died young, and only the most determined passed on their genes. Humans were persistent predators who had chased prey across continents until those prey collapsed from exhaustion. And they were social hunters who coordinated attacks across vast distances using nothing but subtle cues and shared understanding. The Vorath had never encountered anything like humanity before, and they had made the mistake of assuming that small and soft meant weak and helpless. On the 90th day of Una's tenure as Supreme Arbiter, Emperor Kethvorath finally made his move. He appeared in the arena of judgment, alone and armed with the ceremonial blade that had been used by Vorath emperors for 5,000 years. And he challenged Una to single combat. "This ends now," he declared, his ancient voice still carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And I will kill you myself and restore order to my empire." Una stood on the judicial platform where she had pronounced so many liberations, and she looked down at the Emperor with something that might have been pity. "You are 347 years old," she said, "and your exoskeleton has begun to degrade, and your reaction times are less than half what they were in your prime." The Emperor's blade arms trembled with rage. "I have killed more beings than you can imagine," he snarled. "Yes," Una agreed, "but you have not killed anything personally in over a century. And you have grown soft behind the walls of your palace, while I have spent 3 months fighting for my life against the best your empire has to offer." She descended from the platform and walked toward him, and her movements were fluid and predatory in a way that made the watching crowd draw back in fear. "You should have accepted my offer to walk away," she said, "because now I am going to end your dynasty." The combat lasted 11 minutes. Far longer than Una's fight against Rexstan. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Emperor fought with the desperate fury of someone who knew he was dying. But Una moved around his attacks like water flowing around stones, and she wore him down with the patient persistence of a species that had been hunting larger prey since before they learned to make tools. When it was over, Emperor Kethvorath lay dead on the sand of his own arena, and the Vorath supremacy died with him 6 months later. Unipark returned to the Galactic Council chamber on Varanthos Prime. She did not return alone. Behind her walked representatives of 12 species that had been freed from Vorath oppression. Beings who owed their liberty to the human woman who had refused to die quietly. The council members who had voted to sacrifice her sat in their designated sections, and they watched her approach the speaking platform with expressions that ranged from fear to awe to barely concealed terror. High Counselor Yevanar rose from her floating chair, her silver skin pale with anxiety. Ambassador Park, she began, using a title that had been hastily created to acknowledge Yuna's new status. The council welcomes you and congratulates you on your remarkable— Save it, Yuna interrupted. And her voice was flat and cold. She stepped onto the speaking platform and looked out at the 47 species who had sent her to die 6 months ago. You voted to sacrifice me because you thought humans were expendable, she said. And you chose me specifically because I had no family connections, no political value, no specialized skills that could not be replaced. She paused, letting her words echo through the vast chamber. You were wrong about all of it, she continued. And I was not expendable, and humans are not weak. And today I stand before you as the liberator of 12 worlds and the destroyer of an empire that had terrorized this galaxy for 10,000 years. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and none of them dared to speak. I am not here to demand punishment or revenge, Yuna said, because revenge would make me no better than the Vorath. And I have spent too much time among monsters to become one myself. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph of her brother, the same photograph she had carried across the galaxy and back. I am here to deliver a message, she said, and I want you to remember it every time you consider treating any species as disposable. She held up the photograph so that the cameras could capture it and broadcast it across the galaxy. This is my brother Junho, she said, and he is 16 years old. And 6 months ago, I promised him I would come home. She tucked the photograph away and stepped down from the platform. Humans do not break our promises, she said, and we do not die quietly, and we do not forgive those who betray us. She walked toward the exit, and the 12 liberated species fell into step behind her. A council member called out from somewhere in the vast chamber, "Where are you going?" Yuna paused at the door and looked back over her shoulder. "Home," she said simply, "because I made a promise to my brother." And humans always keep their promises. She walked out of the Galactic Council chamber, and the representatives of 47 species watched her go in silence. They had sent a human girl to die, and she had returned as something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. She had returned as a reminder that humanity was not to be underestimated ever. The arena of judgment had witnessed 10,000 years of death and triumph, but it had never witnessed anything like the small human woman who now stood at its center, claiming rights that no alien had ever claimed before. Emperor Kethvorath rose from his throne in the royal box, and his ancient body trembled with rage that bordered on madness. And his voice cracked across the arena like thunder from a dying storm. "This is blasphemy," he screamed. "And this creature cannot invoke our sacred laws. And she is not Vorath." Yuna turned to face him, and her voice carried clearly through the amplification systems that had been designed to broadcast the screams of dying sacrifices. "Your laws do not specify that only Vorath may invoke the right of succession," she said. "And I have studied your legal codes during my journey here. And the law states that any being who defeats the judge in single combat may claim the position." The Emperor's compound eyes darted toward his advisors, ancient Vorath scholars who had spent centuries studying the intricacies of their civilization's traditions, and their silence confirmed what he already knew. The human was correct. The right of succession had been written in an age when the Vorath could not imagine any. non-Vorath being capable of defeating their greatest warriors. And the lawmakers had never thought to specify species requirements because the idea of an alien victory was simply inconceivable. "This is a trick," the Emperor snarled. "And we will not honor. You will honor your own laws," Yuna interrupted. And her voice cut through his protest like a blade through silk. "Because if you refuse, you will destroy the religious and legal foundations that hold your empire together." She gestured at the 500,000 Vorath, who sat in stunned silence throughout the arena. "They believe in the sanctity of judgment," she continued, "and they believe that your laws are absolute and unchangeable. And if you break those laws now, what will stop them from questioning every other tradition that keeps them loyal to your throne?" The Emperor's blade arms twitched with the desire to descend into the arena and kill her himself. But he was old and weakened by centuries of rule, and he knew that a personal challenge would end in his own death. "What do you want?" he finally asked. And the words tasted like poison in his mouth. Yuna climbed the steps that led from the arena floor to the judicial platform where the judge traditionally stood to pronounce verdicts. And she took her position at the center of that platform as if she had always belonged there. As Supreme Arbiter and Galactic Judge, she announced, her voice echoing across the Colosseum and broadcasting to every world in the Vorath supremacy. "I hereby call for immediate judgment of the 3 worlds conquered by Vorath forces in the past year." Confused murmurs spread through the crowd, because judgment was typically reserved for individuals, not entire worlds. "This is not how judgment works," one of the Emperor's advisors shouted from the royal box. "Show me the law that says it cannot work this way." Yuna replied calmly. The advisors consulted their ancient texts and found nothing, because the founders of Vorath civilization had never imagined a judge who would use the position to free rather than condemn. "The worlds of Desha Prime, Kethver 7, and the Yolani Collective are hereby judged," Yuna declared. "And they are found worthy, and by the sacred law of Vorath judgment, they are declared free from Vorath authority effective immediately." The arena erupted into chaos, and Vorath voices rose in outrage and confusion and something that sounded almost like fear. The Emperor leaned forward in his throne, and his voice dropped to a tone that was almost conversational, a tone that Yuna recognized as the voice of someone calculating murder. "You cannot do this," he said, "and you will not leave this world alive." Yuna met his gaze without flinching. "If you kill me outside the arena of judgment, you will be breaking your own sacred laws," she said. "And your people will know that their emperor values power more than tradition, and your empire will begin to crumble from within." She paused, letting her words sink in. "If you challenge me to judgment, you will die. And we both know this." The Emperor's blade arms went still, because the truth of her words was undeniable. "Then we have reached an impasse," he said finally. "And I offer you a deal, human." Yuna tilted her head slightly, inviting him to continue. "Leave now," the Emperor said, "and take your 3 freed worlds with you, and never return to Var space. And we will consider this matter closed." It was a generous offer by Vorath standards, and any rational being would have accepted it and fled before the Emperor found a way to circumvent his own laws. Yuna shook her head. "No," she said simply. The Emperor's compound eyes narrowed. "Then what do you want?" Yuna reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph of her brother, the same photograph she had carried across the galaxy, and she looked at his face for a long moment before speaking. "I want justice," she said, "and I want it for every species you have ever conquered, every world you have ever destroyed, every being who has ever died in this arena for your entertainment." She tucked the photograph away and turned to face the crowd. "I am not leaving," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the Colosseum, "and I am just getting started." And every species that has ever been condemned by Varith judgment will have their cases reviewed under my authority." The Emperor rose from his throne, and his ancient body seemed to grow larger with fury. "You would destroy everything we have built," he screamed. Yuna nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I will tear your empire apart using your own laws. And I will free every slave and liberate every world. And when I am finished, the Varith supremacy will be nothing but a warning to other civilizations about what happens when you treat sentient beings as disposable." She turned back to face the royal box, and her eyes locked with the Emperor's. "Now, shall we discuss the schedule for the upcoming judgments? Or would you prefer to challenge me directly and save us both some time?" The Emperor said nothing, because there was nothing he could say, and the trap had closed around his empire with perfect precision. Yuna Park, the junior diplomatic attaché who had been sent to die because she was considered worthless, now held the fate of the entire Varith supremacy in her small human hands, and she had no intention of showing mercy to those who had shown none to others. The first judgments were scheduled for the following week, and the liberation of the Varith Empire had begun. Supreme Arbiter Rexstan was a nightmare given form, and as he strode across the blood-stained sand of the arena, the crowd's chanting rose to a fever pitch that shook the very foundations of the Colosseum. He stood 3 meters tall, and his exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian under the orange sun, and 4 blade arms extended from his thorax in a display of lethal symmetry that had spelled death for over 3,000 beings across 2 centuries. His ceremonial armor covered his chest and shoulders with plates of meteoric iron, and ancient symbols of Varith supremacy were carved into every surface, and his compound eyes burned with the cold confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. The crowd fell silent as Rexstan raised 1 blade arm toward the royal box where the Varith Emperor sat in judgment of all judgments. "Great Emperor." Rexstan's voice boomed across the arena through amplification systems that carried his words to every corner of the Colosseum. "I present to you the sacrifice of the Galactic Council, a human female selected to demonstrate the weakness of our enemies and the absolute supremacy of our people." The Emperor was ancient even by Varith standards. His exoskeleton faded to gray and covered in the scars of wars fought before humanity had discovered fire. And he nodded once to signal that the judgment could proceed. Rexstan turned to face Yuna, and he walked toward her with the slow, deliberate pace of a being who had never needed to hurry toward anything in his entire existence. "Look at you," he said, his voice carrying across the arena for all to hear, "small and soft and fragile, with skin that tears like wet paper and bones that shatter like hollow reeds." Yuna stood motionless, her arms loose at her sides. Her breathing slow and controlled. Rexstan circled her like a predator examining particularly uninteresting prey, and his blade arms clicked against each other in a rhythm that spoke of boredom and contempt. "Your Galactic Council sent you to die because they consider you worthless," he continued. "And they chose your species because humans are the weakest of all the Council races, barely evolved beyond the primitive animals that crawl through the mud of 1,000 worlds." The crowd roared with approval, and Varith voices rose in mockery of the tiny creature who stood alone on the killing floor. Yuna said nothing, and she did not react to the insults, and her eyes tracked Rexstan's movements with perfect focus. He was circling to her left, and his blade arms were positioned for a sweeping strike, and his weight shifted slightly to his forward legs before each step. "Do you have any final words, human?" Rexstan asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now, because most sacrifices begged or cried or tried to run at this point. Yuna's response was barely a whisper, too quiet for the amplification systems to catch. But Rexstan heard it clearly. Your left rear leg takes longer to recover between steps, she said. And you favor your upper blade arms over your lower pair. And there is a gap between your thoracic plates, just below your primary nerve cluster, where the ceremonial armor does not provide coverage. Rexstan froze. And for the first time in 200 years, something other than contempt flickered in his compound eyes. What did you say to me? Una met his gaze, and her voice remained perfectly calm. I said that I have been watching you since you entered the arena, and I have identified your weaknesses, and now I am going to kill you. The crowd could not hear her words, but they saw Rexstan's posture change, and confused murmurs began to spread through the Colosseum. Rexstan made a sound that was half laughter and half disbelief. You are either mad or brave, he said, and I will carve the answer from your corpse. He raised all 4 blade arms and began the traditional death proclamation, the words that had preceded every execution for 2 centuries. By the authority vested in me as Supreme Arbiter, I condemn this creature to... Una moved. What happened next occurred in 4.7 seconds. And the Varth recording systems captured every millisecond in perfect detail. And those recordings would be studied and debated and analyzed for centuries to come. In the first second, Una dropped to the ground and rolled toward Rexstan's left side, exploiting the recovery lag she had identified in his rear leg. And his sweeping blade arm missed her by centimeters as she passed beneath it. In the second, she launched herself upward using the momentum of her roll, her hands finding purchase on the joints of his lower blade arm, and she climbed his body like a predator ascending prey, using the gaps in his armor as handholds. In the third second, Rexstan tried to bring his upper blade arms around to impale her, but she was already inside his reach, pressed against his thorax where his weapons could not effectively target her. In the fourth second, Una's fingers found the gap between his thoracic plates, the exact vulnerability she had identified, and she drove her hand into his body with every ounce of strength. Her human muscles could generate her. Fingers closed around his primary nerve cluster, and she twisted with savage precision. The 5th second never came for Supreme Arbiter Rexstan. His compound eyes went dark, and his blade arms fell limp, and his massive body collapsed to the blood-stained sand with a sound that echoed across the silent arena like the ending of an age. Una Parks stood on the corpse of the greatest warrior in Varth history, and her hand was covered in the yellowish fluid that served as Varth blood, and her breathing was slightly elevated but otherwise controlled. 500,000 Varth sat in absolute silence, their compound eyes fixed on the impossible scene before them. The amplification systems captured her voice clearly when she spoke, and her words were broadcast across the Var supremacy and secretly transmitted to the Galactic Council. Your judge is dead, Una said, and her voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. And I killed him with my bare hands in less than 5 seconds. She looked up at the royal box where the Varth Emperor sat frozen in shock, and her eyes met his across the vast distance of the arena. You called humans weak, she continued, and you called us fragile, and you thought we would die quietly when you demanded our sacrifice. She stepped down from Rexstan's corpse and walked toward the center of the arena, and her small figure cast a long shadow across the red sand. You were wrong, she said, and now I'm going to teach you exactly how wrong you were. The Emperor finally found his voice, and his command echoed across the Colosseum with the weight of absolute authority. Kill her, he screamed. Kill her now, but before a single guard could move. Una raised her hand and spoke words that froze every Varth in the arena. By blood and victory, I claim the right of succession, she declared, and by the ancient laws of your own people, I invoke my right to take the position of the one I have slain. The Emperor's compound eyes went wide with recognition and horror, because the words she spoke were real, carved into the foundation stones of Vareth civilization 10,000 years ago. You cannot, he whispered. But he knew even as he spoke that she could, that the law was absolute and unbreakable. Una smiled, and there was no warmth in her expression. I am the new supreme arbiter, she said, and I am the new galactic judge, and your laws now belong to me. The arena remained silent as the impossible truth settled over the Vareth supremacy like a funeral shroud. And Unipark stood alone in the center of their holiest ground, covered in the blood of their greatest champion, holding the power of their oldest traditions in her small human hands. The Vareth homeworld of Kethvorin was a brutal place, and its gravity pulled at Una's bones like invisible hands trying to drag her into the ground. And the sky burned orange with radiation from the dying star that the Vareth had worshipped for 10,000 years. The transport landed in a military compound surrounded by walls of black iron, and Una was escorted off the ship by 4 Vareth warriors who towered over her like nightmares made flesh. Each Vareth stood nearly 3 meters tall, and their bodies were covered in chitinous armor the color of dried blood, and 4 blade-like arms extended from their thorax with edges sharp enough to split atoms. Una studied them as they walked, watching the way their joints articulated, the slight hesitation before each step that betrayed the limitations of their exoskeletal structure. They were strong and fast and terrifying, but they were not invincible, and no creature that had ever lived was truly invincible. The compound led to an underground facility where prisoners awaited judgment, and Una was placed in a cell carved from solid rock with no furniture, except a stone slab for sleeping. A Vareth overseer appeared at her cell door, and he looked down at her with compound eyes that reflected her image 1,000 times. You are the human sacrifice, he said, and his voice clicked and buzzed with alien harmonics that made her skin crawl. Una nodded without speaking, and she kept her expression neutral and her body relaxed. Tomorrow you will face Supreme Arbiter Vrextan in the Arena of Judgment, the Overseer continued, and you will die for the glory of the Vareth supremacy, and your death will be broadcast across the galaxy as a reminder of our power. Tell me about the arena, Una said quietly. The Overseer made a sound that might have been laughter, a harsh clicking that echoed off the stone walls. Why should a dead creature care about the place where it will die? Una met his gaze without flinching, and something in her eyes made the Overseer pause. I am curious, she said simply, and curiosity is a human trait that we cannot suppress, even in the face of death. The Overseer considered this for a moment, and then he began to speak. Because what harm could knowledge do to someone who would be dead within a day? He told her about the Arena of Judgment, a massive coliseum that could hold 500,000 Vareth spectators. And he told her about the sacred traditions that governed combat within its walls. The challenger would enter unarmed and unarmored, because the Vareth believed that true judgment required the stripped essence of a being, and weapons and protection were considered insults to the purity of the ritual. The judge would enter in full ceremonial regalia, because the judge represented the absolute authority of Vareth law, and his power was meant to be overwhelming, and undeniable combat would continue until one participant was dead. And there was no surrender, no mercy, no appeal. Una absorbed every word, filing away information like a computer processing data. And what of the judge himself? She asked. The Overseer's compound eyes glittered with something that looked like reverence. Supreme Arbiter Vrextan is the greatest warrior our species has ever produced, he said, and he has held the position of Galactic Judge for 200 years. And in that time, he has executed over 3,000 representatives from conquered worlds. Has anyone ever come close to defeating him? The Overseer made that clicking laugh again. A Kethvari warrior once managed to survive for 47 seconds, he said. and that is considered the longest judgment in recorded history. And Rexstan keeps the warrior's skull as a trophy in his private chambers. Yuna nodded slowly. Processing this information, what about his fighting style? She asked. Does he favor any particular techniques? The overseer stared at her for a long moment, and confusion flickered across his alien features. You ask questions like someone who intends to fight, he said. Yuna smiled, and the expression did not reach her eyes. I ask questions because I am human, she said. And humans ask questions, and it is simply our nature. The overseer shook his head and walked away, leaving Yuna alone in her cell with nothing but stone and silence and the cold certainty of what she needed to do. That night, a Vorath priest came to her cell, draped in robes of deep purple and carrying a recording device in his lower arms. I am here to collect your final words for the archive, he announced. And every sacrifice is permitted to leave a message that will be preserved for eternity. Yuna stood and faced the priest, and her voice was clear and steady when she spoke. Write this down, she said, and make sure you get every word correct. The priest activated his recording device and waited. I'm going to kill your judge, Yuna said, and then I am going to walk out of the arena. And then I am going to tear your empire apart piece by piece. And when I'm finished, the Vorath supremacy will be nothing but a memory and a warning to anyone who thinks they can sacrifice humans without consequence. The priest stared at her with something that might have been shock, and his recording device trembled in his grip. You are insane, he whispered. Yuna sat back down on her stone slab and pulled the photograph of her brother from her pocket. No, she said quietly. I am human, and we do not know how to accept death quietly. The priest fled from her cell, and Yuna could hear him clicking frantically to the guards outside, telling them about the mad human who thought she could defeat the greatest warrior in Vorath history. She did not care what they thought of her, and she did not care if they laughed at her words. She cared only about the promise she had made to her brother, and she cared about the cold calculations running through her mind as she planned exactly how she would keep that promise. The night passed slowly, and Yuna did not sleep. She sat in perfect stillness, conserving her energy, visualizing every movement she would need to make, rehearsing the sequence of actions that would determine whether she lived or died when the guards came for her at dawn. She rose without resistance and walked between them toward the arena of judgment. The Colosseum was even larger than she had imagined, a massive structure of black stone that rose from the orange landscape like a monument to death. And the sound of 500,000 Vorath voices chanting for blood rolled across the desert like approaching thunder. Yuna was led through tunnels beneath the arena, past cells where other prisoners had waited for their own judgments, past walls covered in carved names of the dead. She emerged into blinding light, and the roar of the crowd crashed over her like a physical force. The arena floor was covered in red sand, stained darker in patches where blood had been spilled over centuries of ritual combat, and massive screens displayed her image to the watching masses. Yuna Park stood alone in the center of 500,000 enemies, small and soft and unarmed, and she did not tremble. She simply waited, and across the arena, the gates opened and Supreme Arbiter Rexstan entered to claim his next victim. The Galactic Council chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian floor, and 47 species sat in their designated sections like judges at a trial that never ended. And today they gathered to decide who would die. Ambassador Kethrol of the Vorn Collective slammed his tentacle against the speaking platform, and his voice echoed through the vast chamber like thunder rolling across an empty sky. The Vorath supremacy has conquered 3 of our worlds, he bellowed, and now they demand tribute in the form of a living sacrifice. And we must provide one or face total war. Murmurs rippled through the assembly like waves through dark water. and representatives from dozens of worlds shifted in their seats with obvious discomfort. Because everyone understood what this meant. The Vorath were monsters, and their tradition of judgment was legendary across the galaxy. And no species had ever refused their demands without suffering complete annihilation. High Counselor Yevanar of the Theshan Dominion rose from her floating chair, her silver skin gleaming under the artificial starlight that illuminated the chamber. "We cannot sacrifice one of our own," she declared, but her eyes told a different story. And everyone could see her gaze drifting toward the smallest section of the chamber where the human delegation sat. Humanity had joined the Galactic Council only 80 years ago, and they were still considered newcomers by species that measured their histories in hundreds of thousands of years. And many council members viewed them as barely more than clever animals who had stumbled upon faster than light travel by accident. "Perhaps," Ambassador Cathrall said slowly, "we should consider which species can most afford to make this sacrifice." Every eye in the chamber turned toward the human section, and the meaning was clear without anyone needing to speak it aloud. Una Park sat in the third row of the human delegation, and she was 23 years old with black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. And she had been working as a junior diplomatic attaché for exactly 7 months. She had come to Varanthos, primed to learn about galactic politics, to file reports, to fetch coffee for senior diplomats. And she had never imagined that her career would end like this. The human ambassador, a gray-haired man named Thomas Chun, stood to protest, but his voice was drowned out by the rising chorus of agreement from the other species. "Humans are resilient," someone shouted from the HFY section. "They breed quickly," another voice added from somewhere. "In the darkness, they will recover from the loss of one individual," High Counselor Yevanar declared, and her tone made it clear that the decision had already been made. Una watched as her own species was discussed, like livestock at an auction, and she felt something cold settle in her chest. Something that went beyond fear into a quiet and terrible clarity. The vote took less than an hour, and when it was finished, 43 species had voted to send a human to die, and only 4 had abstained, and none had voted against. Ambassador Chun fought until the very end. But his protest meant nothing against the combined will of the council. And when the security forces came to collect the sacrifice, Una was not surprised to see them walking toward her. Why her? Chun demanded as 2 armored Theshan guards took Una by the arms. High Counselor Yevanar did not even look at him when she answered. "She has no family connections of importance. Number political value, no specialized skills that cannot be replaced," the High Counselor explained. And she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Una said nothing as they led her away from her seat, and she did not struggle or cry or beg. And this seemed to unsettle some of the council members who had expected more of a reaction. As she passed the Theshan section, she stopped and looked directly at High Counselor Yevanar, and her voice was steady when she spoke. "What happens if I survive?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and then laughter erupted across the chamber. Genuine amusement from beings who had witnessed countless species fall before Vorath judgment. "Child," Yevanar said with something that might have been pity, "no one survives Vorath judgment, and the Supreme Arbiter has executed over 3,000 representatives from conquered worlds, and he has never lost a single combat in 200 years. Una nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer, and then she allowed the guards to continue leading her toward the exit. Ambassador Chun caught up with her at the door, and his face was pale with guilt and rage and helplessness. "I am so sorry," he whispered, "and I swear to you that humanity will not forget this betrayal." Una looked at the old man who had tried so hard to save her, and she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph that showed a teenage boy with the same black hair and dark eyes that she possessed. "This is my brother, Juno," she said. And he is 16 years old, and I promised him I would come home. Chun took the photograph with trembling hands, and he did not know what to say to a young woman who had just been sentenced to death by the very institution she had come to serve. "I will keep it safe for you," he managed to say. Yuna shook her head and gently took the photograph back, slipping it into her pocket once more. "No," she said. "I will need it with me, because I intend to keep my promise." The guards exchanged confused glances, but they said nothing as they escorted her to the transport ship that would carry her to the Varith homeworld. The ship was cold and gray and built for prisoners rather than passengers, and Yuna was placed in a small cell with a narrow bed and a viewport that showed the endless stars beyond. She sat on the bed and pulled out the photograph of her brother, and she studied his face as the ship began its journey toward what everyone believed would be her death. The journey would take 2 weeks, and Yuna intended to use every moment of that time. She began by observing the guards who brought her food and water, watching how they moved, how their joints bent, where their armor was weakest, and she memorized every detail with the patience of a hunter, learning the habits of prey. She asked questions that seemed innocent, inquiries about Varith culture and tradition and law, and the guards answered because they saw no harm in educating a dead woman about the civilization that would kill her. She learned about the arena of judgment, about the sacred traditions that govern combat, about the ancient laws that even the Emperor could not break, and she learned about Supreme Arbiter Rextan, the legendary judge who had never known defeat, who stood 3 meters tall with 4 blade arms that could cut through starship hull plating every night. Yuna looked at the photograph of her brother and whispered the same words. "I promised I would come home." And humans always keep their promises. The guards thought she was praying, and in a way perhaps she was. But her prayers were not for salvation. They were for strength, for speed, for the cold clarity that would allow her to do what needed to be done. 2 weeks later, the ship arrived at the Varith homeworld, and Yuna Park stepped off the transport with steady hands and calm eyes. She was small and soft and fragile by galactic standards, and everyone who saw her believed she was walking to her death. They were wrong.